Well, hello everyone. Um, I'm here to present Mathew Leibold. Leibold is currently a permanent scholar and professor at University of Florida. But before coming to Gainesville, he had a professorship position at the University of Texas at Austin, where I first met him and stayed for almost a year as a visiting scholar during my PhD. Before that, he was with the University of Chicago. He was an undergrad and master's student at the University of Arizona and Jim Brown's lab, and obtained a PhD at the University of Michigan with Earl Werner and Don Hall's lab, before doing a postdoc with Henry Wilbur at Duke. Matthew has published 160 plus papers, books, and book chapters, and is best known for his contribution to theoretical community ecology related to need theory, the metacommunity framework, community assembly, ecosystem functioning, and limnology. It's a great honor to have you here, Matthew. Thanks for accepting our invitation and feel free to start. Thank you.
Okay, just let me know if you can hear me.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So let me figure out how to use this. Okay. Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor. I also wanted to thank the speakers this morning. I didn't catch everyone, but I caught parts of Denise and part of Christine's talks, and so that's been really great. So I will, maybe the panelists could turn on their video so I'm not looking at just gray squares. That would help me. Yeah, so I do a lot better if I'm looking at someone when I'm talking. And let me share my screen. Does that look good? Are you guys looking?
We are seeing the way you, not the presenter mode. We are seeing the comments and all that.
Okay, how do I fix that? Okay, I will try something else. Now?
No, the same.
Sorry, may I interrupt?
Yes.
Professor, I think if you click with the right button of your mouse on the presentation, there is an option like hide presenter view, something like this. You have to click on the presentation, like in front of the slide or something, with the right button.
Okay, I have a Mac, so it doesn't have a right button, but I'm...
Okay, sorry.
Swap displays, maybe that'll do it.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, awesome. So, yeah, so the talks so far have been really good. I really enjoyed what I caught, and I'm excited about talking about indirect effects. I want to put a little bit less scientific context for my talk, just for fun. I don't take this too seriously, but I'm going to start by talking about Nemesis. Nemesis was a Greek goddess, and she enacted retribution to those who did not pay proper respect for the gods. And so here I'm going to call the gods nature because, well, we're scientists. And so yeah, so here's a painting of Nemesis. She's obviously not very happy with this guy, and etc. And the metaphor I want to use is that these indirect effects are really at the root of our problems in community ecology. And we are still not sure how to handle them with the proper respect. In case you're thinking that the Nemesis is not active, you might want to know that this painting is somewhat famous because the person who obtained it in a lottery in Frankfurt. And when they won the lottery, the person who won it had committed some crimes and had this on their wall, and apparently it drove him mad. So it's an ancient Greek goddess, but she's still active today, or at least in the 19th century. So just beware. In other words, as they say in Texas, don't mess with Nemesis. So anyway, enough of that. Today, the word Nemesis conjures up a little bit different type of being. First of all, it's typically a male. Here's one from Resident Evil. I don't know anything about Resident Evil except that some of the people in my lab have played it, and I don't play video games, so forget it. But he does not look very nice, and he's not very interesting. He just comes after you over and over and tries to kill you, I gather. Anyway, it's not as interesting. But what I want to do in this talk is talk about indirect effects. And in the introduction, I'll just talk about what they are and how do they work. And this would be material that I would normally teach in an undergraduate class, for example, in ecology. In the middle part of the talk, I'll talk more about the ways that indirect effects affect important concepts in community ecology. And the first one is how they affect the way we think about coexistence theory of competing species. The second one is how they affect the way we think about community assembly. This would be material that I would normally teach or cover in a graduate level course. And then the third part is how I think we can think about indirect effects more comprehensively in community ecology in the future. And for me, this third part is really exciting. I feel like community ecology has finally begun to have the tools needed to address community ecology on realistic terms, on terms that can begin to help us understand indirect effects and that sort of thing. And so I'll be kind of getting excited in the third part. If I get too excited, please forgive me, but you know, why not? First of all, so indirect effects, what are they? Maybe you think you know, but it's worth thinking about a little bit more. So indirect effects is the idea that species can affect each other indirectly due to the presence of other species in the community. And so there's a net effect, which is the direct effect, plus the various indirect effects. And so just to kind of get some ideas about what we're talking about, we can separate them into indirect chains. And these would be indirect effects that are mediated through changes in the abundance of other species. So I'll show you an example in a minute, but that basic idea is that species A might affect species C, not because it ever interacts directly with it, but because it affects species B that then affects species C. The other scenario that we can think about is interaction modification. So here, the idea is that there is a direct interaction between two species, but it's context dependent on the presence of another species. And I'll show you an example of that. So the first example I want to talk about is the indirect chain idea. And this is a really cool study by Knight et al. Here's a picture of Tiffany Knight. And what she and her collaborators did is they ask this question that is typically not asked, which is there any way that fish in a pond can affect the ecology of the plants outside the pond? Most terrestrial ecologists, when they study plants, don't even know where the nearest pond is. And most pond ecologists, when they study their bugs and whatnot, they just stick their head in the pond and look around, and they're oblivious to the plants that are next to the pond. But the story that Knight et al. Were able to develop is shown in this little picture here. And the idea is that fishes have big effects on some of the organisms that are in the pond. So, such as, for example, the larvae of dragonflies. But these dragonflies, they don't complete their life cycle in the pond. They come out and they become dragonflies out in the terrestrial habitat. When they do that, they are voracious predators, and they will attack all kinds of insects. One of the ones that they attack are pollinators. And so since pollinators are sometimes really important to the population dynamics of plants through their effects on seed production due to pollen limitation, they could have this indirect effect. Sounds like a crazy story, maybe, why not? Let's see if it's true. So I'm not going to discuss these results in too much detail, but basically they show evidence for each of these steps. So it's plausible. And what they were able to also show is that the amount of pollination limitation was changed by the presence or absence of a fish by a threefold factor. So not trivial. So the insights from this study are that the indirect effects can be strong. Here, threefold effect on effective seed set. And that goes against some of the arguments that people have made for dismissing the importance of indirect effects, which is, oh, there's a lot of stuff going on, dragonflies, sure, but there's so much else going on that this isn't important. A second conclusion is that the indirect effects are maintained through numerous links. This isn't just a one-shot deal, it's multiple links. And similarly, others have argued that they dissipate because of these other factors. And so that also is not supported by this experiment. And the other one is that indirect effects are propagated through space and habitats. So in this case, ponds to terrestrial habitats. That's a bit surprising. People have talked about indirect effects mediated through more subtle habitat changes, but not very many through this kind of aquatic to terrestrial. So important insights, and we'll keep those in mind. So here's an example of interaction modification. I like this study because one of them is that I was there when this study was conducted. I didn't have anything to do with it. I just was at the same place at the same time. And the story here shown in this t-shirt that you cannot buy anymore, but I have one. And I was gonna bring it, but I forgot. Anyway, it describes the black bass attack. The black bass attack is showing with this largemouth bass that's slicing through a milfoil bed, the macrophytes in the pond, and it's engulfing greedily a bluegill. Meanwhile, there's another one that escapes for the moment, okay, for the moment. And blah, 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 you can get a nice t-shirt, not anymore. So that's kind of the story that was developed by these researchers. It's in a lot of ways a trophic cascade, except that it's not mediated through a change in the abundance of organisms. So what these researchers did is they had an artificial pond that they could drain and fill at will. They put curtains across it to separate it into segments like a pie, like a pizza. And they put a known number of bluegills in each slice of the pizza, and then 2 very large bass in half of the half of the pizza slices, kind of like anchovies, and not in the other one. Some people don't like anchovies. And they monitored what happened to the zooplankton. And they found that indeed, in the presence of bass, a number of these zooplankton species were more abundant and were not suppressed as much as in the presence of the bass. The surprising thing here, though, is that none of the bluegills, well, one bluegill died in the experiment due to bass. So the trophic cascade existed, but the bass did not kill any bluegills. In fact, the bluegills weren't affected in their body size either. And so what happens, one thing that happened is that when there were bass, the bluegill just decided, hey, it's too dangerous out there. Don't go out into the plankton, into the open part of the pond. Just stick to the weeds and eat insects. And so that's shown in this little graph here. And in the where there's no bass, the bluegills ate zooplankton. It's even more interesting, and this part is not so related to what I'm talking about, but it's kind of intriguing, that half of the bluegills said, ooh, zooplankton, I like it. And the other half said, ooh, insects in the weeds, I like them. And so they did some sort of niche partitioning. So why does this happen? Well, fear. So the bluegills are not dumb. They see a big bass out there and they just go, this is not good. I'm gonna hide in the milfoil beds like the one that got away. There was only one that got eaten. Everybody else escaped, and not just for the moment. They escaped for the duration of the experiment. So fear is one of the most important means for getting interaction modifications. So this leads to this idea of landscape of fear, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to skip over that because it's really fascinating in its own right. But the important thing is just that there is a mechanism that makes sense. And we can think of other mechanisms that can make sense. People have looked at the relative importance of indirect chains and interaction modification using meta-analyses. And what they found is that the effects of fear on prey is about as strong as the killing effect. And so one way to think about what that means is that the organisms on average are pretty good at titrating their fear against their actual risk. So they, should I be afraid? Should I go? Should I stay? Should I go? And they're actually pretty good at knowing which, balancing the two. I don't have a choice anymore. That sort of idea. The other thing about that is that the Leibold models that serve as the backbone of community ecology don't generally do very much with fear or with interaction modifications. Interestingly, is that the indirect effects mediated through fear are more consistent and stronger than the direct killing effect. Intriguing. The classic case for thinking about indirect effects is trophic cascades. Most of you probably know about that. Here's an example of that's kind of sexy because it's got orca, it's got otters, everything is really cool in it. Plus it's aquatic. I like that. But the story is here that hunters at the turn of the century had almost eliminated sea otters. That had allowed sea urchins to just become prolific and dominate the subtidal. And they wiped out the kelp. And then when they stopped hunting them by making it illegal to hunt sea otters, the sea otters bounced back. They wiped out the sea urchins, and that allowed the kelp forests to recover. The latest wrinkle, well, I don't know if it's the latest, but an additional wrinkle is that killer whales had decided that sea otters made nice little snacks and started attacking them for somewhat mysterious reasons. And what that means is that sea otters were less abundant, sea urchins started coming back, and the kelp forest was decreased. The reason I wanted to bring this example up is that because it tells us that these indirect effects are not just of academic interest to nerds like me, but they actually have important consequences for applied issues. And that's because the amount of carbon that's stored in the kelp forest is quite substantial. And so on a global scale, people have figured out that the sea otters are worth about $500 million. You know, here's an indirect effect. I think it's kind of cool, but so should anybody. And so they're not just cute and they're not just interesting. They have a really valuable carbon footprint. Okay, so trophic cascades are kind of cool. Many studies have done them. However, it's important to realize that this is not the only thing that can happen through indirect effects. And that's because food chains and really simple food webs are rather rare. So here, for example, is one of the simplest food webs I know. It's found inside the pitcher plants of, inside the leaves of pitcher plants. And it already has bacteria. We don't know quite how many taxa. There's about 10 species of protists, and there's 3 species of insects that live in, that are specialized to this habitat, a rotifer and a mite. So, you know, not too complicated. Maybe we can figure this out, and it, you know, would require a lot of work, and there are people working on it, but even so. Realistically, this is what we get. Here's a simplified food web, okay? And this looks worse than my spaghetti. You know, good luck trying to figure out indirect effects here. You know, there's an indirect effect, oops, between the flatfish and, you know, something over here, euphausids and capelin and cod and haddock and swordfish, blah, blah, blah. You know, good. You have to be brilliant to be able to understand this. So how are we going to resolve things in nature and respect Nemesis with this kind of complexity? Well, we can think about some lessons to be learned, some important features that can result. So I'm going to start with one, which is statics. Here I'm going to refer back to this work by Larry Lawler. I'm going to talk about him a little bit later. But what he did was derive theoretically how we might figure out what net effects is, not necessarily indirect ones, but what net effects is if we understand the direct effects. And the way he did that was to use data from this classic study on warblers by MacArthur that measured their habitat use of these 5 species of warblers. And then MacArthur had already estimated the overlap in habitat use and proposed that this was a measure of competition. So the alpha ij's that would go into your Lanka-Volterra model. And he calculated a way to derive the net interactions. I'll show you that in a minute. And what he found, a couple of things. One of them is that the net, so here's the matrix of the direct interactions. Here's the matrix of the indirect interactions. And by and large, the magnitude of the direct interactions is larger than the magnitude of the net interactions. And that's because these species are interfering with each other's abilities to compete And in particular, there's one pair of species that via their direct interactions here would be predicted, according to his method, to be mutualists. Well, they're not mutualists in the direct sense. They're mutualist in the indirect sense. And that's because they both suppress this species here of a warbler, who is a nasty competitor. And so in this case, the enemy of their enemy is actually their friend. And so that's what underlies this mutualism. You could say, okay, so that's for the bay-breasted and Blackburnian warblers that are shown outlined in blue here. And you can, I use the same trick that Lawler used to calculate how they would interact if the black-throated green, this species over here, were absent, and it turns out that they would compete. So the presence or absence of a particular species can change the sign of the interaction between the net effect and the direct effect. Indirect effects can also modify the dynamics. And so here's an example involving a predator-prey cycle from the work by Bohannon and Lenski. And they had chemostats, which they put E. coli and T4 phage in a chemostat. And during the first part of the experiment, they observed what one would be tempted to call classic predator-prey oscillations, with a quarter cycle lag between the predator and the prey. They knew enough about this system to anticipate that a mutation in E. coli would eventually arise that would confer resistance to the T4. And so they waited for it, and they had ways of detecting it. And so when it showed up, indicated by this arrow, here was when they first detected the resistant E. coli. The oscillations completely changed in their frequency, their period, and even their nature. So if we think of a mutant E. coli as being the same as an additional species, this would tell you that an extra species could change the very nature of the interaction between any pair of species. Okay, so now we have some idea of how they work and why Nemesis is going to be tough to address. So let's think a little bit about how this affects the way we think about community ecology. And there's lots of ways in which we could do this. I'm going to focus on just these two. One of them is how it affects coexistence theory, and the other one is how it affects what we think of as assembly rules. So basically, just as a reminder, the net interaction can depend on the identity of other species. A change in anything that alters one species, birth rate or its death rate, can have cascading effects through the indirect interactions. And these indirect interactions, if they go multiple links, could take us anywhere else in the food web. And so some species may have an indirect effect on a very distantly related species, like the fish and the plants, the terrestrial plants in the Knight et al. Study. And the other thing that people know is that natural communities consist of these complicated webs of interactions. And so this is the challenge that we have from nature that I'm saying we should respect. Okay, so what do these, web of interactions look like? Here's this study that I really like by Sonia Kiffi et al., where they did this work on the Chilean intertidal, building on an extensive database on how various species interact with each other in this system. And so you have all of the, there's 104 species in here, and they interact via trophic links in the blue, non-trophic links in the gray, and possible non-trophic links in the pink. And you can see that this is, they've rigged it up so it doesn't look like spaghetti, but it is. It's just spaghetti that someone has, you know, arranged. And so if we imagine that, you know, some fishery decides to exploit this little species over here, let's say it's an abalone or something like that. Well, it doesn't look like it's doing very much here through its direct effects, but conceivably, it could be affecting almost any other species in this web through these chains of indirect interactions. And if it gets overexploited, then that'll also change things. So let's think about how it affects the way we think about competition in community ecology. So usually when we think about competition, what we think about is the interactions between species that we think have similar niches. Okay, and we just kind of go, forget about all those, you know, the details. They compete. This is what MacArthur did with the warblers. Okay, and that's affecting the theories that we have, that we use, like the Lotka-Volterra competition models, or also what's increasingly called modern coexistence theories, such as the types of approaches developed by Chesson and his collaborators, and etc. And in that theory, they pretend that this is an indirect effect, but really it's not, or not always. And so, for example, we can imagine that we're looking at these two species, and in actuality, they're competing for some other species. So MacArthur's warblers, they're competing for the kinds of insects that use different parts of the tree. And there's not just two of them, there's, I don't know, you know, a large number, dozens at least. Similarly, we could reverse this and think about two species that interact with each other, not through their resources, they don't share any resources, but through their enemies. So they share common predators or common diseases or parasites or something like that. And of course, we can mix the two, etc. So lots of mechanisms that are getting, you know, lumped into the way we think about competition. So MacArthur figured out that this maybe wasn't a very big problem. And he did it this way. So he thought of the Lotka-Volterra competition equations shown here, which, you know, if you're not into the math, just kind of squint and trust me. But the rest of these equations is meant just to remind the rest of you what this is based on. And he said, well, really, they are competing for different resources. And so I'm going to put an equation for the resources and an equation for these possible competitors. And he did a lot of fancy math. Well, it's not that fancy by today's standards, but at the time it was fancy. And he calculated that you could derive these parameters in the Lotka-Volterra competition equation from these parameters. Okay, and that's shown here. So, you know, you can do this. And what he found was that under some conditions, this was a possible solution. So nice, great, Nemesis, out the door. We don't have to worry. It's all going to come out because, you know, these parameters up here, we don't know what they mean, but they will be linear and they will be measurable in a competition experiment. The K is also measurable and the B is also measurable. Okay, so don't worry, you know, Nemesis, you know, it's not a problem, okay, right? Right? Soap. Oh. Okay, so what are these conditions? Well, one of them is a separation of timescales, and that means that the resources are on very, very fast timescales. So here, think, for example, of zooplankton feeding on bacteria. Bacteria are on a time scale of minutes. The zooplankton are on a time scale of days to weeks. Very separate time scales. Another one is that everything is linear. So in the mechanistic model, the interactions between the resources and the consumers Those are linear equations in MacArthur's proof. There aren't any other interactions. The resources don't compete with each other. The consumers don't fight with each other directly, etc. There's no dispersal. There's no evolution. There's no, I don't know, whatever you want to invoke. So a pretty simplistic scenario. And, you know, it's not really very well appreciated whether these assumptions are critical or just convenient. And so maybe we can hope that we can get away with this trick. And so that may or may not be true. So one partial solution is to look at modern coexistence theory. And largely that's based on the work of Peter Chesson, et cetera. And the reason this is an advantage is because we don't assume a steady state. We instead kind of convert the problem into a community assembly problem and you know, see if we can understand coexistence, not from Locke-Volterra equations, but from community assembly. And so what that work involves is calculating when each species can invade the other or others whenever they've done whatever they do. So there's still a little bit of a time scale difference, but at least we're sort of getting away with a different set of assumptions. And then also figuring out if the other species invades, does the first one go extinct? So this math is quite a bit more complex than what MacArthur did. You know, if you really want to know the details, go ahead. But it's not necessarily super easygoing on the theory front. But the conclusion is that there are two criteria that matter. One of them can be called the competitive ability difference. Some papers call it fitness differences. And we can think of them, if we were to use Locke-Volterra models, as the difference in the carrying capacities. Okay, and then the other one is the what they call niche differences. I think everything is niche, so I don't see why this isn't niche, but that's me. But what they mean here is effects that stabilize the coexistence and ensure that each species will have a bigger negative effect on itself than on the competitor. So we can think of that as something related, if we're constraining it to the Locke-Volterra model, to the difference between the geometric mean competition coefficients and the geometric mean of the intraspecific population regulation. Oops. So, so that works sometimes, but it turns out maybe, so it seems to work for resource competition between two species. So that kind of resonates with MacArthur's results, but it doesn't necessarily always work. And here, Mark McPeak, who's a really good friend of mine, has been doing this kind of analysis on different types of scenarios. So the scenario where species share a predator, for example, or the diamond kind of arrangement, predators and resources, and finds that they do not. And that's because the indirect interactions are more complicated in those scenarios than in the resource competition scenarios. There's also a really cool paper that is in press, but available, I think, in bioarchives by Dalmerigos and Bunin. And it uses a completely different approach based on statistical mechanics to obtain results that are consistent with that for different reasons. So, okay, you know, we have a problem, you know, but, you know, we can't say that we should ignore this. You know, we still have to try to solve this problem. So how have people done that in situations where there are many, many species? And so here, unfortunately, we have to go back to Lotka-Volterra models. And we go back especially to the concept of the alpha matrix that was developed by Richard Levins. Here he is in a picture I found that was more or less what he looked like when he did this. Here's a more recent picture. This idea of the alpha matrix, and it's also sometimes called the community matrix, can be really confusing. I'm going to aim you towards this paper by Novak et al., which is really helpful. And Lawler, who is the guy that we talked about with MacArthur's warblers already, derived the relationship between direct and net effects as being the inverse of the community or the alpha matrix. And so here was a perfectly good mathematical way of looking at the alpha matrix and deriving the net effects. In fact, that's what he did when he studied the MacArthur's warblers. I can't find a picture of Lawler. He was hired as an assistant professor at University of Texas, which is where I was before being at University of Florida. And he was doing really good work, and then for some reason he didn't get tenure, and so he gave up science, and I heard he was a woodworker. Seems to be a disease that community ecologists also suffer. Mark McPeak is also an excellent woodworker. Ironically, when I got hired at University of Chicago, I ended up having the same space, office space and lab as Richard Levins. It's a small world. Anyway, fun. So right now, this inverse matrix is really the only way that I really know of to relate competition mechanisms to distributions, because in this case, we would hypothesize that if something affects the carrying capacity of one species, we can derive the net effects or the partial derivative of the net effects with respect to the other species in the system. So the problem is that it only works if they're linear, steady state. Basically, we're back at the same place. And Nemesis is still chasing us down, hoping to cut off our heads or whatever it is. Horrible, drive us mad or something like that. Horrible consequences. So, but I'm an optimist, and I always think, okay, the glass is half full. And one of my quotes that my students claim I use all the time is, you do the best you can with what you have. And I thought that was a quote from my dad, but it turns out it's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, who's got a picture here. I found that absolutely every photo of him outside, he has exactly the same pose. So, you know, when you took Theodore Roosevelt and you said, we're going to take a picture of you, he just put the elbow out and the arm down, etc. I'm kind of calling him an ecologist because he wasn't really an ecologist, but he started the national park system in the US when he was president. So, you know, accept him into our community, etc. So, okay, so now the modern coexistence theory is telling us that we can transfer the problem to a community assembly kind of approach. So what does that mean? So here's a little diagram of what people usually mean by community assembly. This is from a paper by Mittelbach and Shemsky. And basically the story is, we imagine we have a species pool out there that's defined by, you know, something. And we want to know what kind of species are found in local spots. So, you know, if you're a pond ecologist, you would call this a pond A or pond F, pond whatever, you know, pond A, pond B, pond C. And you imagine that what's determining which species are there from the species pool is this kind of three-step process. First of all, there has to be enough dispersal to get there, and there is some stochasticity associated with that. Secondly, there's an environmental filter. The species have to be able to exist in the local conditions in the pond, given that they've arrived. And then the third filter is this biotic interactions. Once they're there, they duke it out with each other, and some of them win and some of them lose. So through the different expression of these filters, we can end up with different communities. And here, they're kind of showing that there's feedback from these interactions to these filters, and they are calling that coexistence theory. But the community assembly is the entire process that we are looking at. So we can think of lots of issues with this problem. One of them is defining the species pool. You know, is it all the organisms in the world? Well, at some level, yes, because there could be dispersal limitation. But, you know, that's not very practical. There's so there's mutualisms. There's I mean, if we think of the basic processes, we have 3 of them here. There's other processes, mutualisms that mean that it's not so much the environmental filter that works first, because if you require a host or something like that, a positive interaction, it might be much more important to go with the biotic filter first. Disturbances, source sink relations, evolution, metacommunity stuff. Don't worry, I'll talk about metacommunities and temporal fluctuations. So how do we model community assembly? Well, there's various kind of approaches. I'm going to focus on one of them for now, which is what I'm calling the permanence approach. And the permanence approach was developed primarily by this guy, Richard Law. And I can't find a good picture of him. There is a picture of him on the internet, but he's wearing camo. And in the US, that is totally inconsistent with who Richard is. So I found this old photo. I'll show you the photo later of where I got this. But Richard, in addition to being extremely thoughtful and creative, is one of the nicest community ecologists I've met. So I like to put his picture there, even though it's a crappy one. And the idea that he pursued was that species arrive into communities one at a time. And if successful, they invade. And then once they invade, all the species duke it out. Some species may go extinct. The invader may go extinct eventually, etc. And so they interact at a fast time scale relative to the arrival of the next species. The species cannot coordinate their arrival together to mess up this process. And so eventually, through this process, you end up with species from the species pool that are constrained. Sounds plausible, you know, maybe reasonable. So here's kind of a diagram of it. We have 2 species here. I made this up. There's 3 ways that the community could be occupied. Could be empty, could be occupied by species 1, could be occupied by species 2. This way, species 1 always outcompetes species 2. So if it gets colonized by species 2 is happy, yay. And then species 1 arrives, and that's it. It goes over to this one. And you could add extinctions if you want, which go back this way. But anyway, that's the idea. So this is called a community assembly graph. It tells you which, what are the stages in the assembly of the community. And you could have many paths that lead to the same outcome. So here there are 2 paths that eventually take you to 1. You can get crazy with it. So Jose Capitan has done some of this. And here's one of his crazy graphs that makes an important point. So if I understand this graph properly, which I'm not super sure I do, it starts out here with an empty patch, just like the one before. And then there's all sorts of ways that species can colonize this and change the composition. But eventually, all of these paths lead to Rome. Over here. Okay, so you know, there's many permutations for how you get to this endpoint, but this, at least these equations that went into making this graph, tell you that there's one final community. And the reason I put this in is to illustrate the Humpty-Dumpty effect. And so the Humpty-Dumpty effect comes from this rhyme in English from England, which is also known in the US. But it goes, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's soldier and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And it's meant to illustrate that this community cannot be assembled by itself. So in order to get there, you have to go through these other communities. And these other communities have other species. And so you cannot rebuild this community without these other species. Make sense? Okay. This idea is not easy to interpret or to develop using Lawler's method. Okay, and if you were to actually want to use this for your community, you would have to figure out all of these paths, or at least most of them, or whatever. That's not very tractable in any sort of realistic setting. So it illustrates the problem. Nemesis is here and is telling us we have a problem, and we're not going to solve it using the brute force method. Another one is something called assembly cycles. So assembly cycles is a case where you have a particular community gets invaded by another species that changes it. And then a subsequent invasion by another species changes it again. And then, but eventually you will come back to this original community. So there is no single endpoint. It's just a cycle. And so that's pretty interesting. Jose Capitan again did this study in theory and found that this doesn't have to be a simple cycle. It can be this really complicated endpoint assembly attractor, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, crazy. How are you going to figure that out? I don't know, but Nemesis is telling us that we need to be thinking a little bit more about that than we have. So there's other approaches. Mark McPeak, as I was saying, is working on this book that explores how you might use mechanistic models to look at all possible assemblies, not using permanents, but using isocyclines. And unfortunately, it's not possible to do more than about 5 or 6 species before you go mad. And so Nemesis is going to put a boundary on this. So there's simulations that you could use. That's perhaps useful, but not always very satisfying. And I'll be talking a little bit about a third approach, which is based on statistical mechanics, which has also got its drawbacks. And I'll talk about them when I get that. Your other option is just to say, it's too complicated. Let's forget about the species interactions. We'll just go with it. And my point about that third option is, well, good luck, because Nemesis is going to come and drive you mad eventually when you start looking at your data. Okay, so the last part of what I want to talk about, and I'm probably going to have to go a little bit fast, is going to be a crazy ride with the kinds of ideas that I'm thinking about. And so here, in this last part of my talk, I want to not be held responsible too much, because I think it's more fun for me to tell you about this work. And even though some of it is still very provisional, but I hope you'll enjoy it nevertheless. So more comprehensive approaches to, can we get away from community assembly? Can we get away from coexistence theory. So one important suggestion was made by Mark Vellon, and I imagine he's going to talk about that on Friday or whenever he's up. We'll see. I'll try to be there. He suggested that we should just ditch Laca Volterra and all that stuff and think about community assembly based on, or community dynamics based on kind of fundamental processes that are very parallel to the ones that drive evolution and that we have come to understand pretty well in evolutionary theory. So he thinks that there's a parallel between abiotic and biotic filters that's parallel to our idea of selection in Darwinian evolution, that there's a stochastic demography that's similar to genetic drift. There's dispersal. I got this wrong on this slide, sorry. It should say dispersal, which is similar to gene flow, and speciation, which is similar to mutations. And so this is a very general approach. You know, so far, I wouldn't say that we have a humongous group, you know, very well-developed grasp of how this is going to help us understand net effects and indirect interactions, but it's an important conceptual thing, and I'll be using this idea in some other approaches. So other approaches, I'm going to talk. I mean, obviously, I've worked a lot on meta-community ecology. Here's, by the way, here's Richard. That's where I got that other photo. This is the only one I have. Here's some of my other mutualist friends in this effort. In case you're wondering, this is me. I've aged since then. But this was a working group at NCEES, and it's easily the most exciting aspect of my career to have been involved with that. What we did in this work is we tried to evaluate existing theories about metacommunities, and we classified them into 4 paradigms. Since you know, that has had a pretty substantial impact, and what I've realized recently is that it does a poor job of addressing the nemesis. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we can modify these ideas. I wanted to put this picture in because we can also think about evolution in metacommunities. And this is another group of my friends that helped think about that. It's not so important to this talk, but I just wanted to do it. And one of the other really nice guys in community ecology is this guy, Mark Urban. Anyway, whatever. So we'll talk a little bit more about metacommunity ecology in a minute. Another approach that has been increasingly important is the development of joint species distribution models. As far as I know, Francis Huey, this guy, was the first person to develop these, but they've been, there's a pretty rapid developments in this line, especially the work by Otso Ovaiskanen. So this is a completely data-driven approach, or very strongly data-driven approach, without necessarily super tight links to process-based models, except for this paper by Rybicki et al., who one of the al's here is Otso. It's a very sort of comprehensive statistical approach that tries to determine how occurrences, co-occurrences, and occurrence patterns in a landscape are determined by environment, spatial temporal context, and species niches, meaning the stabilizing components, and then random variation. So these are rapidly developing methods that are still kind of mysterious. So I got interested in these joint species distribution models and thought, okay, maybe we can link the three species, the three approaches: one, Velen's general processes; two, metacommunity ecology; and three, joint species distribution models. And so we have this paper that's in review. A preprint of it is in bioarchives. And so what we do in this paper is we generate data with a patch dynamic model with environmental heterogeneity. It's not comprehensive or anything. It's just one possible way to simulate community assembly. We analyze the results with the JSDM methods, and we ask two questions. One of them is, using JSDMs, do the variation components make sense? And I'll talk about that in a second. And the other one is, do the parameters make sense? The estimators of the processes make sense? And what we did that's a little bit different than most of the previous work with JSDMs is that we asked about the internal structure of the metacommunity. And the idea here is that there is no single set of parameters that determines the group effect of species interactions. Instead, all species contribute idiosyncratically to metacommunity dynamics. So some of them have very high dispersal rates, some of them have low dispersal rates, some of them have high extinction rates, some of them have low extinction rates, some of them have narrow niches in the environment, some of them have broad niches in the environments, some of them interact with each other strongly, some of them weakly. And can we make sense using those basic processes that Veland discussed to try to understand the internal structure rather than just the emergent structure? So we can kind of look at that by relating the variation components to each other. And so if we go back to the old school, nowadays old school, variation partitioning approaches developed by Postgraduate and others, we see that, at least in terms of variation partitioning, their approach was novel at the time and really innovative, because it told us that this distribution of species wasn't just a function of the environmental filters, but was also had some spatial patterning, largely due to dispersal dynamics. The JSDMs go one step further, and they say, okay, we've got all this variation that we can relate to environment and space, but there's still residual variation. And this residual variation could have structure in itself. It's, the residual variation could have correlations between species that is not random. And so they've developed the JSDMs. The main defining feature is this third component of variation that describes these correlations among species. And what we did was to say, okay, let's imagine that we're going to plot this for different species. And this is the internal structure part. So in this triplot, each dot is a species. The size of the dot is proportional to the R² of the model for that species. So what that means is that small dots are species that have large random components that cannot be explained by these three factors. Larger dots, there's more explanatory power in these three I, E, and S. And then if we look at the proportional contributions of each of those three factors, we can put them in here. So what this means is that this species over here is very, has a high R², so we understand its distribution well. And the most effective way to quantify its distribution is by looking at its association with environments that were measured. This species over here has a low R², so a fair bit of stochasticity, but whatever components of predictability there is don't seem to have much to do with the environment. And so they're mostly spatial. So it's got something presumably to do with dispersal. Maybe their environmental niches are extremely broad. They don't really care about the environment, but they are patchily distributed in the landscape. And then the tricky one is these species up here. And the idea here is that these species have distributions that are not easily related to the environment or to space, but have a strong component that's related to the distribution of other species. So this is kind of a little bit mysterious. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that means, but it's interesting. So, this is what I mean by the internal structure of a meta community. We can imagine that different predictors would predict these various components. So for example, we could look to see if high or low dispersal is associated with the magnitude of the environmental variation component, etc. Or the other thing that we did was we figured out how to calculate these similar variation components, not for different species, but for different sites. And so what that means is that, for example, if we go here, this is a different site, a different patch in the meta community. And this would tell us that the species that are found at that in that patch can be related to the environment of that patch. Make sense? Okay. Other patches in the meta community have species compositions that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the environmental conditions. Instead, they have to do with spatial components, presumably nearby sites. And so this patch over here, this is telling us that there's some predictable component due to the distance away from other patches. And then similarly, these kind of patches are arenas where these species interactions play out in important ways and are not related to the environment. So we're juggling meta communities, we're juggling fundamental processes, and we're juggling variation components. I think that's kind of cool, but it doesn't really help us with Nemesis too much, and I'll show you that in a minute. So we made some progress, but not on the Nemesis front. Okay, so here's some simulations showing what I'm talking about. We simulated species pools where and environment landscapes where the niches along the environmental gradient are narrow versus broad, and otherwise the interaction coefficients in the spatial landscape is the same. And we see that in this case, if we look at species, they spread out according to this pattern. So there are some species that are just in patches due to spatial relations, other species that are in patches very strongly related to the environment, and then quite a few species whose distribution is kind of a mixture of everything. Similarly, if we look at the patches, we see similar kind of variation. Some patches you can tell who's there by the environmental conditions. Some of them you cannot, but you can tell who's there by spatial patterning. And some of them you can tell seem to be not related to environment or space, but be indicative of the interactions among species. Here's what happens with broad niches. As you might guess, the environmental component basically goes away. And so now these species just don't care. None of them care about the environment, so it's not important. And similarly, the patches go like this. We played around with it a little bit. So for example, here we did the same kind of simulation that we did with the narrow niches, but now half of the, we had 1/3 of the species be poor dispersers, 1/3 be good dispersers, and 1/3 be intermediate. We find that the intermediate dispersers tend to have distributions that are much more affected by species interactions than otherwise. And we can try to relate that to predictors. So here, for example, this is telling us that the environmental fraction of any particular species distribution is related to how central it is in the environmental gradient. So species that are specialized to the extremes are not very central. So they're, anyway, might have this figure wrong, but that affects things. And the, oh, sorry. Yeah. So this is the, how central they are. And this is the dispersal rate. So highly dispersive with low niche centrality. So that's, yeah, low niche centrality. Species that are specialized to extremes of the environment and have high dispersal are the ones that have the highest environmental component. We can also do the same thing by sites, and what we found in this simulation anyway was that the environmental deviation where the site was in the environmental gradient was really, really strongly determinant of where the environmental fraction. You can see that here by noting that the yellow dots are all here and the purple dots are all there. So what about the interactions? So that's kind of useful, but it doesn't tell us about interactions. So let's look at that. So we use the same alpha matrix for all these simulations. It looks like this. We hypothesized that species that were adjacent to each other along the gradient, the species are arranged in that order, compete strongly, and they don't compete with other species that are further down the gradient. And then we looked at their co-distributions, and we had 5 replicate metacommunities, and we find that the co-distributions that we think reflect the net interactions are more complex and that they are not consistent. Okay, so this goes against Lawler's hypothesis, because if we invert this matrix, we should always see the same inverse. And if these are meant to be Lawler's matrices, they don't look like they're the inverse of the same matrix. So this is telling us that we still haven't conquered Nemesis using this approach. It is kind of some progress. The variation components are informative and interpretable. We can look at the internal structure. We can do this for species. That's the conventional approach. But we can also do this for sites. And that means that we can maybe link this whole set of ideas to landscape ecology, which I think is really exciting. But the Nemesis is still on us. And so we aren't really doing so well. But if we go back over here, we can kind of squint at these matrices and say, well, they do have some features in common. So one of them is this checkerboard pattern where we have red and gray alternating in the distribution of species. So that's interesting. Seems to be a consistent pattern. Sometimes it's really strong, sometimes it's not so strong. Parts of the matrix are stronger than others, in some cases, not in others. You know, whatever. The other thing is that the average values of these interactions are similar. The average and the variance seem to be somewhat similar. And so this kind of raises the question, maybe we can't quite defeat the Nemesis, but maybe we can understand these features of the net interactions. So that's kind of, I'm going to skip over this because I'm over the thing. And so this kind of gets to a project that I've started. This project is like totally crazy. I don't want to be held responsible for it, but just thought I'd share my excitement because that's where we are. And so in this project, I worked with Mathew A and Guy Boonen, and we are trying to address this using statistical mechanics. And so basically, I'm going to describe the statistical mechanics, and then we're going to try to link it to Metacommunity and to JSDMs. So the paper that really influenced me to look in this direction was by Barbier et al. It's a really cool paper. I'm like really excited about the work that these guys have been doing. And they argue that we can have all this complexity that's normal in community ecology, and we can have complex dynamical models. Here they're using linear models, but at least in theory they could be nonlinear. And normally we would study community properties, and here they look at diversity, functioning, and stability. But you could imagine other parameters. And they claim that we can sometimes do a pretty good job of predicting these parameters by converting this complexity into these sort of driving patterns. So the spread of the carrying capacities, the variance, the mean interaction strength, this is the mu, the variation in interaction strength, oops, that's the sigma, and the mean reciprocity. Are they symmetric with each other or not? And they claim that by going this way, we can also predict that. And they ask, how good is it? Okay, so under ideal conditions where their model, their assumptions of the model match the simulations, they find pretty good fit. So here the solid lines are the the lines are the prediction from their theory, and the dots are the simulation results. So that's pretty good, except over here where the variability is a little bit harder to predict when you don't have very many species present. What's really cool is that then they ask, well, what if it isn't completely random structure? So to do that, they studied situations that look like this, where it is random. There's no pattern in which species are connected with blue dots, which species are connected, blue lines, which species are connected with red lines. And then they said, well, what if they are structured so that, for example, these red lines could be competition and these blue lines could be predator-prey interaction, so like a trophic web. And what they found was that when they tried to predict this using their reference model, it did a crappy job. On the other hand, they could use similar methods to separate these interactions into 3 types, each of which would have its mean and its variance in interaction strength. And when they do that, they find that they can predict the blue line, the actual values, the blue triangles reasonably well. You can imagine that there's a lot of possible ways of using this approach. So I started working with these 2 guys, Mathew and Guy Boonen, to try to look at that and see if we could incorporate metacommunities and JSDMs into the question. So we modify the basic equations to allow for dispersal and environmental differences. That wasn't present before. And we generate predictions using simulations like they did. And then we generate predictions using the theory about features that are in the JSDMs. That also wasn't done before. And we compare the theory to the simulations. And we ask 3 questions. Now, here, I don't want to take too much responsibility. These are preliminary results. We'll see where they go. And we ask, if you know the environmental gradients, how good do the JSDMs do in describing the environmental filters? JSDMs are telling us that we should be able to do this. And then if we know the alpha matrix, can we predict the co-distributions? So the spoiler alert is that the news isn't so good. So the JSDMs do not predict the basic environmental filters, abiotic filters, very well, and I'll show you what that means, and it's pretty obvious what the problem is. If we know the alpha matrix, we can predict it to some degree, but only if we have no extinctions in the meta community. That's relevant because Lawler's theory tells us that the inverse matrix might work under those conditions, but would not work if that was not the conditions. But regardless, we found some just amazingly cool that we can predict their statistical features reasonably well. I mean, you know, give me a break. We'll see how well it does. Okay, so here's the simulations. We have a landscape with an environmental factor that's shown, you know, in these different colors. We have a bunch of species with niche centers along the environmental gradient and niche spreads shown by these lines. And here's the outcome of the simulation. Each one of these is a different species and its distribution in this landscape. This is a model where we have weak interactions and low dispersal. If we go to a model with strong interactions and stronger dispersal, you know, we get a different kind of landscape. This landscape differs from that one because some species become extremely rare and effectively go extinct, whereas none of the species go extinct here or even approach it. So if we look at the fit between the JSDM and the basic environmental, you know, filter, how carrying capacity varies with the environment, we find that when the interactions are small and the dispersal is low, it does not do a good job. So here the orange ones is the model parameters that went into the simulation, and the blue line is the JSDM estimate. So not so good. There is a correlation between the location of the peak of the fitness function and the peak of the estimated fitness function from the JSDM. But the effect on the spread is extremely biased. The spread is a lot narrower than the parameters. If we go to stronger interactions, paradoxically, the fit of the peaks is better, but the spread is also not so good. So this is the case where there were some extinctions, and so you can see that there are, you know, whatever it is, 6 species that went extinct, and we have no estimate for their distributions. The other thing to notice is that in both of these cases, the spread is narrower than the model. And what that means, I think, is that the JSDM is actually quantifying the realized niche rather than the fundamental niche. And so that's okay, that's useful information, but it's good to know what it is. What about the biotic interactions? This is Nemesis here, the interactions part. What we did was we tried to say, well, the covariation in abundances should be similar to the covariation in carrying capacities. So species that have similar carrying capacities will have similar distributions along the gradient, and etc. So here we've arranged the species in order of their optima. And what you can see is that if the species that are specialized to the ends of the gradient should covary positively, and species that are not should covary negatively. We then, this matrix over here shows the actual covariation between species. And what you can see is that there are some blanks in there. Those are the species that went extinct. And there are, and it forms this kind of checkerboard pattern in the patterning of it. We calculated the difference between this matrix and that matrix, and that's shown here. So this is telling us, you know, if the carrying capacities are important, how are they being modified by species interactions when they are also present? And then we calculated this matrix based on the theory, the modified theory from the statistical mechanics approach. In the case of small interactions and low dispersal, we can see that these two matrices look a lot alike. I mean, this is nice. And if we plot these values against these values, we find that we have a pretty good predictive ability. However, if the interactions are stronger or if the dispersal is higher, we get more fuzzy predictions. And then the pattern of actual covariation is quite different from the one that's predicted. And if we plot them against each other, there is a positive correlation that is significant, but it's not, you know, it's not very impressive. So this is Nemesis here. The cool thing that we discovered is that if we plot the mean value of this matrix against the mean value of this matrix, and if we plot the variance in these entries against the variance in those entries, they are correlated with each other. So here, that's what's shown in this graph. And the size of the symbol is the correlation, is this correlation here. Okay, so so this is, each one of these is a different simulation with different amounts of dispersal and interaction strengths. And we find that the means are reasonably well correlated and the variances seem to be correlated. This data point here is annoying, but you know, it's just one. So we'll see how that goes. So the conclusion is that this last part is pretty complicated. We are still thinking about this a lot. I don't want you to think that I have any feeling like we've really answered it very much. And when I say we need to think about this, I include Mathew, Guy, and myself as well. But those two last graphs are promising. So what that means is that we can account for the general behavior of net interactions. And maybe someday someone will be smarter and figures things out even more. But we might be able to relate these general patterns to distributions. Of course, there's a lot of work to do. I'm getting older. You know, sometimes I think I should retire, but I don't think I'm going to retire right now. This is way too exciting. And so if I start getting to the point where I'm totally befuddled, maybe, but right now I'm quite excited. So I think I've tried to convince you that Nemesis is something to deal with and that we might be able to deal with Nemesis if we are not too arrogant. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Mathew, for your talk. It was a great talk. We do have a few questions. Are you listening to me? Is it?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So first question is by Carolina Souza Oliveira. She's asking, the indirect effects are very interesting. I am investigating in my master's degree how the effects mediated by protective ants occur in plants with extrafloral nectaries in the Brazilian Amazon. But my perception is that the indirect effects are neglected and little studied. Do you agree? If so, to what do you attribute this gap?
Yeah, so I know, you know, ants, Amazonian forests, like I'm a wet guy normally, and not by rain, but by habitat. Yeah, I do know, I have a colleague in my department at University of Florida, a guy named Todd Palmer, who I think has tried to address this mechanistically, not using the same kind of a general approach that I'm interested in, but more asking, okay, what are they doing to each other and how do they play these games? I think he's mostly using game theory to think about his approach. And so I think that would be a place to start, but you know, here, you know, I don't know quite what to say. The only other thing I would say is you should do it and good luck.
Okay, next question is from Paula Maria Rosa. Would you consider changes in behavior caused by parasites an indirect effect? Something like the one you showed with the fish, dragonfly, and pollinators example?
Not so much with the fish dragonfly, but with the bass, bluegill, zooplankton. So I would consider it to be a at least my first response, if I understand the scenario that you're thinking of with parasites, is that it would be more likely to be an interaction modification. Of course, in the extreme sense, when parasites just kill their host, then it would be an indirect chain. But I'm thinking of cases where the behavior, parasites change the behavior of their host so that their interactions, for example, with their predators is altered.
Okay, next question is from Christian Dumbros. I hope I am pronouncing it properly. The presentation has been wonderful. It seems ecological processes are too complex and models can produce basically any outcome. Nevertheless, we see general patterns like diversity productivity, species area relationships. Does it mean we are still missing the most fundamental and important aspect organizing all communities from most models and like evolution? And what are the steps you expect for the next decade regarding the development of those models?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I had a crystal ball to see in the future. But yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist. And so, you know, I've talked about Nemesis, and it's easy to think about Nemesis as a diabolical force that is going to prevent us from understanding ecology. I have a slightly different view of it, which is that we can make progress in that direction by recognizing the problem and by trying to think of ways to address what we can. And so here, at least in this last part, what I'm proposing is that we can understand the distribution of net effects, even if we have a hard time understanding the precise net effects. And so I think if we focus on that approach, we may be, I mean, this is of course speculation because I haven't even started thinking about that question, but in response to your question, I would think that using those principles, we may be able to understand things like the other types of patterns that you're talking about. As far as evolution goes, I'm not sure yet. I think it's fascinating, and I've worked on microevolution and its effects on distributions. But yeah, that's probably pushing a bit more than I'd be ready to speculate.
Okay, next one is from Gabriel Xavier Boldorini Ariero. I think this one is about the assembly cycles that you mentioned in your talk. Can these assembly cycles be mediated by mass effects?
That's a good question. One person that has, I think, looked at that a little bit is a guy named Sebastian Schreiber. And he's looked at heteroclinic cycles, which have some of the same features as those assembly cycles. They're not developed in the context of colonization and extinction, so they're a little bit different. But I think they indicate that if you have a lot of dispersal, then you may reduce the possibility of these assembly cycles. Another place to look is work by Guy Boonen, my collaborator on this last part. And he and Mathew and some other people are trying to expand this statistical mechanics approach to situations that have strange interactions and stronger interactions. And I'm not going to claim that I fully understand what they are doing.
Okay. Next question is from Otávio. It's about the Humpty-Dumpty effect. He asks, in this Humpty-Dumpty effect, do we consider only contemporary communities, or do we also consider their assembly history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess if we don't have any disturbances that cause extinctions, then yeah, we can think of it as evolutionary history. I mean, one way to take it to the extreme is to say that the communities we have today were modified by primitive algae back in the early part of the evolutionary history on Earth. And those algae, assuming they don't exist anymore, have helped, have done what we are describing. So yeah, yeah, the Humpty-Dumpty effect, I don't know, what, I think you can choose to think of it at any temporal scale you want.
Okay, one more from André Adrian Padial. Dr. Leibold, great honor to hear your speech. You told us some important features about how to consider interactions among species in community assembly, but individuals from the same species also interact among each other. Such density dependency effects could affect our understanding of community assembly. If so, how do you think we can consider this? How do you think we can consider this together with the other community assembly mechanisms?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I don't know that I have a super smart answer. It's possible to incorporate some of those differences into matrix models. So for example, if we think about the fish with the dragonflies and the plants, one of those transitions was the larvae to adult transition. And so if we have an equation for each one, we can imagine that would play out. The other one is to think that individuals differ because they differ genetically, and the dynamics might be influenced by selection on those genetic differences. And I think that's an important component. The third way is that it's mediated through plasticity. And I think it's possible to imagine that the equations we use in that theory can kind of accept plasticity into the parameters. But there, I wouldn't really want to express a very strong opinion.
Okay. Next one, probably the last one, from Ingrid Lima. How can we use the effect of local dynamics to the metacommunity scale?
Yeah, well, so what this is saying, I think, is that, I mean, the metacommunity scale is kind of the emergent properties of the local dynamics, right? If we go back to that graph about community assembly by Mittelbach and Shemsky, it's telling us that the filters depend on the feedback from the interactions. And so there could be a brute force approach that you could use. So for example, if you were studying the food webs inside of pitcher plants, it's conceivable, that some crazy person, and there are crazy people out there, could measure all of those interactions and derive those the metacommunity properties from knowledge of the local dynamics and some extra stuff like dispersal. If you are interested in Amazonia, I don't think that's going to be very easy. because there are so many species, it'd just be crazy. And that's why I'm attracted to this method based on statistical mechanics, because we could imagine measuring the means and the variances of the carrying capacities, and the means and the variances and the reciprocity of the interaction coefficients. You know, you just need a mean. So you don't need every species, you just need a reliable estimate of the mean. Of course, you know, then you've got structure. So for example, they're structured in different trophic levels, and then you have to get the mean and the variance within and between the trophic levels. So it's not easy, but maybe high throughput, I don't know. The alternative is to work to inverse model the problem, which would be you measure these properties in a real metacommunity, and then somehow you derive using inverse statistical modeling what these parameters must be like, and then you could test some of the parameters to see if they would work. Inverse modeling is still, I mean, some people are doing it in ecology. I think it's really interesting to think about, but I wouldn't necessarily think that's going to be easy either.
Okay, I think this is it. Thank you so much for your talk, Matthew. It was
Obrigado.
really inspiring.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I guess we did.
Thank you.
So we have a few announcements before we end the section today. Now I'm gonna just speak in português.
Go ahead.
A gente gostaria de avisar que as palestras elas vão ficar disponíveis no YouTube. Talvez essa informação seja importante ser dada em inglês. We would like to announce that the talks will all be available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch them again later or just send it to a friend, they will be all available. And yeah, I think that's it. We will be coming back tomorrow. We'll be back here tomorrow at 8:30 to hear Diogo Provetti's talk about evolutionary dynamics. Bom, a gente vai estar aqui de volta às 8:30 amanhã para ouvir a palestra do Diogo Provetti sobre dinâmicas ecoevolucionárias. É isso. Muito obrigado pela presença de todos hoje. Nos vemos amanhã de novo.
Obrigado, gente. Até mais.